workshop on managing wild species and systems for food security. The workshop is a combination of two previously submitted workshops, one on crocodile relatives and one on the systems for food security. And the organizer asked us to merge, which we think it was a good idea because all the resources and the genetic diversity we're talking about are within forest and wild systems. But yet there are some elements that are distinct. And clearly the crocodile relatives part is an important resource that is found in wild systems and forest for food security, but is mainly an indirect use because the main use of crocodile relatives is for breeding purposes. And other food that can be found in the forest and is used by local communities is something that has been managed for centuries or thousands of years. And it is therefore important to better understand how they contribute to food security of these communities and how these management issues can be better brought forward. The workshop is jointly organized by CIFOR, Bioversity International, PAR, and there are other important stakeholders that contributed to it: WWF Indonesia, ICRAF, the World Agroforestry Center. The workshop will be divided into different presentations. I will start making a speech on the crocodile relatives, and my colleagues, whom I asked them to introduce themselves in a few seconds, will bring up the different other aspects that are the subject of this workshop. At the end of each presentation or speech, I will ask there will be a short question and answer sessions if you have burning questions. And at the end of the workshop, there will be a discussion, which I hope all of you can contribute on how a roadmap and how the conservation aspects and management of those systems for food security can be improved, and where the funds can come from, and what are the key issues that are relevant for the conservation of these systems. So I'll ask my colleagues to introduce themselves. My name is Carlo Fadda. I work for Bioversity International. I'm based in Nairobi office in Kenya, and my background is on conservation of genetic diversity.
Sorry about this. My name is Christine Paddock, and I direct the program on forests and livelihoods at the Center for International Forestry Research in Bogor in Indonesia. And I'm here with a number of my colleagues. Perhaps I can introduce them. One of them is Dr. Robert Nassi, who is the head of CRP6, which is a consortium-wide research program on forest trees and agroforestry, and he also resides in Bogor in Indonesia, and he'll be talking here largely about issues of bushmeat and conservation and food security. My other colleague, Dr. Terry Sunderland, who's here, as well, is also a principal scientist in the Forests and Livelihoods program at CIFOR, and concerned largely with sort of heading up many of CIFOR's initiatives on food security and also on dry forests. We also have two other participants whom you will not see, but you will see their presentations. One is Dr. Christina Egghenter from WWF Indonesia. Unfortunately, at the very last minute, she found it impossible to come here because of other pressing commitments. However, she did send us a paper and a presentation, and I'll be happy to present those and also sort of stand in for her in the discussion. And also we have a participant or a presentation from ICRAF, from the World Agroforestry Center, their Southeast Asian office, which is located with us in Bogor, and that's from Dr. Hesti Listari. And you'll see her presentation as well. ICRAF is having its 1 week when they all get together in Nairobi, and so they weren't able to send us a representative. So, but all of these, I believe they've tried to put their thoughts clearly here, so we do recognize the participation of all of these other institutions. I'd now like to hand it back over to the co-organizer, Dr. Kadlo Fanda, who I don't think actually, oh, he did introduce himself, that's right, and we can continue. Thank you very much. And I do encourage you, if you'd like to sit a little closer, so at least afterwards when we would like to have a discussion.
Thank you, Christine. So we start our work here. So first of all, let me introduce the crop-wild relative issue. What are the crop-wild relatives? The crop-wild relatives are wild species that are closely related to crop species. Of course, the concept can be extended further to include also ornamental plants, industrial crops, etc. But basically, it's the foundation of agriculture today. The issue of conservation of crop-wild relative is a broad one. It is estimated, even if it's very difficult, of course, to estimate how many are they, because it depends on how you define it and also on the knowledge that we have on the taxonomy of plants. It is estimated that broadly there are about 50,000 species of crop-wild relatives worldwide. And therefore, the conservation aspect of it is, of course, extremely broad. It is important to prioritize which one one might want to conserve. And in this respect, considering the major crops, those that are contributing more to our food security today, it is estimated that there are around 800 species that urgently need conservation action. The main use of crop-wild relatives is, and their contribution to food security is through breeding. The crop-wild relatives, because they didn't, in the domestication process, they didn't went through genetic diversity narrowing and bottleneck caused by domestication, they possess a diverse set of genes that can be very useful, for example, to provide resistance to pests and disease, to adapt, and these days to adapt to climate change as well. So they're broadly used, and there were more so in the past, to provide those genes for crops. And the major use of crop-wild relative was 60–70% of crop-wild relative in breeding was to provide resistance to pests and disease. Of course, there are cases where the crop-wild relatives are also used directly by local community, and this is particularly the case of the wild yams. Many parts in Madagascar, but also in Benin. Those yams are used by local communities for improving their domesticated yams, but also for direct consumption. And you can imagine the value, so therefore that those crop-wild relatives have. Just one estimate, in the 70s there was a blight outbreak in the US that caused 50% loss of crops and an estimated $1 billion damage to the maize production in the US. The resistance to those to that blight was found in a crop-wild relative. So only for that case and for that single disease, the value of those crops was enormous. There are other works as well that gave an estimation of $110 billion US value globally of the crop-wild relative for breedings. The other key aspects, so the contribution of crop-wild relatives is very important. The other key aspect is, of course, where those crop-wild relatives are, because if we want to conserve, it's important to know where they are. And of course, because we're talking about an estimated 50,000 species, we can imagine that they are everywhere. And again, we need to make a choice of what we want to conserve. And of course the choice is depending on the threats, how much they are threatened and what are the threats. The threats, because we are talking of wild species, is the threats that are affecting the all the other wild species. So habitat fragmentation, loss and degradation of habitats, climate change, genetic erosion due to this habitat fragmentation, pressure from harvesting. For example, the wild yam in Madagascar was used commercially and for home consumption, so it was over-harvested, so the wild yam was threatened for extinction. So it needed that immediate conservation action. And again, because, and in many cases, those crop wild relatives are found in forest and already protected areas. We'll talk a bit more about it when we discuss about the required conservation action, but not necessarily so. Many wild relatives are also used directly within production system of farmers. They're found in the borders of farmer fields, they're found in the border of roads, and they're found in an environment that are already disturbed and degraded. And in other words, there is no real intervention to conserve them. Therefore, the conservation status of those species can vary largely. But the conservation has not been fully addressed because of several reasons. They are not really taken seriously by the agriculturalist practitioners, except for the breeders. So those dealing with conservation of agricultural biodiversity, they tend to a bit put the crop wild relative aspect a bit aside, and also the conservationist groups are not really looking at the conservation of crop wild relatives, because normally in protected areas the main target is to protect pristine environment, ecosystems, or species that can be shown like can have a high impact on the general audience. And the crop wild relatives sometimes are species that are very weedy species, which are not really so fascinating. So even within the protected areas where there might be populations of crop wild relatives with high genetic diversity, they're not the target of any type of management, and they're sometimes even ignored and even not known that those species are there. So there is certainly a need to put more emphasis and to make inventories of where those crop wild relatives are, and particularly within the protected areas. And for this to be possible, of course, there is therefore a need to try to convince both the activists in conservation and agricultural scientists that there is a need to look more into the conservation of crop wild relatives. And it's therefore important to define in this aspect what the priorities are. I was saying before that crop wild relatives are 50,000, and I mentioned that the most important one were estimated to be 800. Now, the other aspect is, and therefore this has came because of the use of the past use of crop wild relatives for breeding purposes. So it was including the main crop wild relatives were used for maize and rice, followed by barley. There is cassava, there is peas, etc. But the important thing there is that there is also a need to understand what to put in place a proper conservation action, to understand how the genetic diversity of those different species of wild relatives are distributed. And therefore it is important to understand their distribution in the different environment and ecosystems. And for this there are several actions. One in Europe that is studying the distribution of wild relatives in the Mediterranean and Europe areas, and which can provide a framework for broader conservation of crop wild relatives in other areas, because level of details that this work is developing is quite important. There is a need to look at from an ecological point of view, to look at when it's not possible to collect direct information on the genetic diversity. Is probably important. It's probably relevant to have to look at the different environments and to protect, to create a set of genetic areas for conservation where those in different part of the agroecological system, so that one can ensure that the different populations have different genetic background, and therefore you conserve a larger part of the genetic diversity of those crops. So there are several actions that are possible for the conservation of the crop world relative, and possibly this will be discussed later on when we look on the roadmap to the conservation of the system in the broader sense. I think for now I leave it here. Each presentation, I forgot to say before, is about to last for 10 minutes, roughly. And I think I'm at the end of the point. So if you have a few questions before I pass to the next speaker, I'm glad to take them. No? Okay, so I asked Terry to give his presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Carlo. I'm going to give a very general overview of forestry issues related to food security, and this is a presentation I've given a few times, and I think that we'd like to frame the debate in terms of incorporating forests in the whole food security debate, which in many respects has been a neglected aspect of food security. So I'll proceed from our again. So food security, we're all aware of the definitions of food security. This is the standard definition from the World Food Summit in 1996. I'm not going to read it out because it's pretty standard, and most of us know essentially what it is. But ultimately, one of the main issues is that the definition of food security is related to what is enough food, and it's not about nutrition or sustainability. And so there are some major issues with the definition of food security in certain respects. Human well-being is also very closely related to wider environmental health, as the bullet point says. But ultimately, the issue of food security is related to not only the amount of food, but the diversity of nutritional supplements. So in terms of forest biodiversity and food security, research at CIFOR has shown that almost 1 billion people are reliant on forest products to some extent for their nutrition and income. And in many instances, biodiversity provides a very important safety net to most rural livelihoods. And I work on poverty and environment network, which I'll present on Monday, I think. This is Monday. Will show that actually forests play a very important role in terms of supplementing food and nutritional security, particularly in times of agricultural problems or other issues. Robert's going to talk a little bit about wild harvested meat, and bush meat provides a significant proportion of protein to most rural communities. And for primary healthcare, forests and their environments provide a very important role in terms of providing medicinal plants and other aspects of primary healthcare. An interesting study that was undertaken a few years ago showed that up to $90 billion of forest products are traded in terms of rural livelihoods, but this is a very nebulous trade in many respects. It's a very unrecorded and part of the informal forest economy. And in terms of biodiversity, and as Carla mentioned, the whole aspect of agricultural products and other resources from the forest are worth an estimated $500 billion a year. And this is made up from not only from agricultural resources, but also medicinal plants and other resources. So we're talking about a huge investment, if you like, for forest resources.